Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host, and today we're going to be talking about engagement, but not just for employees. We're going to be talking about engagement across the organization. I hear this all the time, frustrations around engagement for employees. I mean, we hear all kinds of statistics that are pretty staggering how many disengaged employees there are in any industry, in any business, but especially in the nonprofit world. But I think nonprofit leaders have a compounded challenge of keeping not only just their employees engaged, but also their board members, their volunteers, and any other individuals that might be, helping an organization with their mission. I'm not an expert on this, although I live and breathe this world every day. I have a guest today, Rhonda Travers. Rhonda, you are the founder and president of Travers Training and Consulting. And Rhonda, you bring tons and tons of experience in leadership development, specifically around employee engagement and nonprofit capacity building. So together, we're going to unpack some of these ideas, challenges, as I always say on this podcast platform, that even if we don't have all of the answers, maybe at least we'll get a little bit of validation. So hopefully, Rhonda, you can validate us a little bit today when we're talking about engagement. Before we dive in, Rhonda, thanks for joining us and spending your time with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So let's just dive right in. Let's start with what most nonprofits miss, and that's an overlooked resources that they might already have. Let me rephrase that differently. What is an overlooked resource that nonprofit leaders might already have that can help them magnify their mission and their message and maybe help with some of this engagement?
Oh, it's your own volunteers. Your
Okay, volunteers.
volunteers are an overlooked resource. And nonprofits have an advantage. They have a talent pool that's wider, that can collaborate with their employees and their teams. And that
Hmm.
your board members and your volunteers are built-in brand ambassadors. They're
Mm.
built in. Your volunteers will also help with administrative functions too, with all the different roles that
Yeah.
nonprofits have, that volunteers fill. So that's just like a resource that a lot of times, some nonprofits don't really leverage that,
Yeah.
and really, that like I said, they're your built-in brand ambassadors.
Yeah. I like that we start with volunteers because, I don't know if you know this about me, Rhonda, but I worked for a nonprofit for a period of time. And when we had different projects, initiatives, things that we were struggling with, oftentimes people would lift up, can we get that pro bono or can we get that, essentially a volunteer to do that? And as the person that was the staff member that had the project that needed to be complete. And the most significant one that comes to my mind is like we needed some website work done. And we didn't have a whole lot of money to do it. The board was like, can we get those pro bono services? And as the person that was going to be potentially working with this provider, I'm just like, oh my gosh, because sometimes volunteers can be a huge benefit, like you're talking about. Sometimes you're treated like it's a pro bono job, right? It's in piecemeal. It's like goes on longer than you thought. Maybe the quality or the responsiveness isn't quite what you would expect. So I'm curious for those organizations that seem to do a pretty good job with leveraging volunteers, what are some of the things that they're doing that maybe the rest of us aren't? And I say that as someone that didn't really have a skill or built a skill for managing volunteers in my former job. I probably need to build some skills in order to effectively use volunteers. I mean, I've been a volunteer for organizations, and some organizations do this really well, and some don't. But I have to confess, I've never been in the volunteer management side of things. So I'm curious, in order to best use volunteers, what are some of those few things that organizations can do or not do that the really good organizations are?
That's a great question. And, I've had the pleasure of working with, organizations and nonprofits and associations, because associations really rely on their volunteers to get their mission done as well, with their members and their membership is, some really have a great solid program. And then
Mm,
others, like you mentioned, it's just kind of not in the forefront of your mind.
hmm
And the one thing I want to point out first is volunteers and your board follow the same life cycle as your employees. Your employee
mm,
life cycle have 4 stages to them. So how are you attracting the talent that joins your organization? How
Mm.
are you onboarding your talent? Then how are you retaining and engaging your talent? And then lastly, do you have a plan to offboard? So a lot
Oh.
of nonprofits, they have that in place for their employees, but they don't always have that in place with their board members and their volunteers. And so
Hmm.
having that is like the first step is, thinking through from the lens of a volunteer, how
Mm.
it's going to help them so that they can align with your mission and they can be, built in a resource for you. And I have the lens of a volunteer. I have been in leadership roles for over 20 years.
Hmm.
And it's just definitely been a great experience. And I love talking with nonprofits and gaining either best practices from those who have it as a
Yeah.
well-oiled machine and are supporting hundreds of volunteers. And I also work with nonprofits who are just getting started. And maybe they only have a team of 5
Right.
volunteers.
Right.
And so the critical piece is having, looking through what is our life cycle? Do we even have a plan to
Mm.
address all 4 of those stages? And one thing that I have seen is it's easy to say, hey, can you volunteer for our organization? It starts with
Yeah.
that ask. How are you
Yeah.
even attracting the talent that fits the needs that you have within your organization? How are you attracting
Hmm.
that talent? Where volunteers need that flexibility to understand what is that role. And with volunteers,
Hmm.
there's 3 primary roles that you can fill. One is a point in time. So say your organization's planning a trivia night or a golf outing or something
Hmm.
that is
Hmm.
a 1-day event.
Hmm.
And so you need volunteers for the day of.
Hmm.
If you're asked, hey, can you help volunteer for us right now? Your first initial response is going to be probably, ooh, I'm busy. I don't have
Right.
time, because they don't have clarity around the point in time that you need. But the
Mm.
more defined you have with your role to say, wow, we need some volunteers to help us for about 8 hours on such and such date. And these are the
Mm.
roles that we need our volunteers to help with. That's going to provide the clarity in your ask with the volunteer of, does this align with their schedules?
Sure.
um, because some roles are that point in time. Other roles are continuous, like board
Right.
members. You need
Right.
them to be present on a continual basis, at least quarterly, perhaps monthly. So that's more of a continual commitment.
Right.
And then the last one is virtual. So, volunteers who, like you mentioned, who can work on your website, can work on
Hmm.
some of your marketing materials, they can do that at midnight if they wanted to,
Right.
because it's going to be something that aligns with their personal commitments,
Yeah.
outside of helping you. So that's the first piece, is understanding, well, what are the rules we have as volunteers, and
Hmm.
being able to clarify that, what kind of time commitment. Because if you
Mm.
just ask a general question to someone, hey, do you have time to help us? With a busyness that we have in society today,
Yeah.
the first response you're going to see is, oh, I'm so busy.
No,
I,
right.
I don't
That's
have
the
time.
default.
Exactly.
I love that. So you talked a little bit about s setting clear expectations and maybe being a little bit more specific about what you're needing. And it makes me think about my own leadership motivation engagement with respect to employees. And I know you do some work with employee engagement and volunteer engagement and board engagement. So I'm really curious, talk to us about what is similar between, or other things that could be similar between employees, since most of us might have some sense of what leadership looks like in that capacity. And how is that similar to working with volunteers or board members? What other ways are they similar or different, maybe?
Oh, sure. The way they're similar would be addressing, do you have a process in place for each of those cycles of how you're
Hmm.
attracting your talent? And then how do you onboard? How do they know what to do when they first help you? Do they know
Hmm.
what day one is? Is there an orientation? Do you have
Yeah.
resources to share? Do you have responsibilities and an overview?
Yeah.
So thinking through that, and then also, how are you staying connected with both your
Hmm.
board members and your volunteers?
Hmm.
Because it all goes back to what I have an acronym for, is that there's 4 core needs that we all have as people,
Hmm.
regardless if you're employees, volunteers or board members.
Okay.
And that is, people are looking for flexibility. So what that looks like is different if you are working with an employee versus if you're working with a volunteer. People want appreciation and recognition. They want to know that they're valued and heard. People want to be informed. So going back to those roles and responsibilities, what am I, why am I here?
Right.
And, and then lastly, people want to be empowered. People want to know that they are making a difference. And that's going to be the same with an employee as it will be a volunteer. So for example, I follow Simon Sinek. I don't know if you follow Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
Oh, and I love the power behind your why. We are all motivated differently.
Right.
So employees are motivated differently about why they're joining your organization, and it can be a wide variety. Volunteers are very similar. They're motivated to join your organization, but the way you work through that and navigate through that is a little different. So it's similar but different. One thing I see with nonprofits is when they're looking at volunteers, they're looking at what they do all day and then thinking, oh, that's going to transfer greatly to what we need in a particular role. For example, I have a CPA, I have an accounting background, I'm a recovering auditor, 30 years of background. And over 20 years ago, I got involved with a nonprofit. And what do you think the first role they offered me as a volunteer?
Treasurer, bookkeeper. You are doing the accounting.
And accounting chair, okay? And once again, volunteers are choosing to spend their extra time with you. So they're motivated why they're going to spend extra time with you differently than an employee. And so that was the first role. But because this organization had all their roles defined for volunteers, I was looking through them and I wanted a specific role. And it wasn't the accounting chair. And it's because I was joining that organization because of my personal story of how my family and my 2-year-old nephew at the time was impacted by cancer. And I wanted to help out with the day of event with a particular part of their ceremony that meant very much to me personally. So because they had their roles defined, I was able to make a selection based on what motivated me. If you are, the more you can align what motivates your volunteer to why they're spending time with you and how that aligns with their mission, their personal connection, the more engaged you're going to have that volunteer because they're in it for a particular reason. So getting to know your volunteers and their why is really going to, because what would have happened if I would have taken that accounting chair role?
Yeah.
I probably, but I was with this organization and I eventually helped run this entire event and work with teams of volunteers and different committee chairs for 15 years. So I'm sure nonprofits would love to have volunteers come back year after year, helping in any capacity they can for 15 years. And it's all around aligning their motivation to your mission.
I love that.
And their why.
You've talked about the busyness of the world. I'm curious, just getting volunteers to sign up or really board members to sign up. But more importantly, since we're talking specifically about engagement, I'm curious, what do you see as impacting volunteer and board engagement kind of in today's world? We talked about having meaningful roles, busyness. Are there other things that maybe we're not quite thinking of that could be impacting the way that our volunteers or our board is showing up or not?
Well, a lot of it is our evolving technology and our evolving environment. We have so many things right now competing for our attention.
Yeah.
And so many different communication channels. So if you're only trying to reach your board members and your volunteers through just one communication channel, that might not be as productive because emails, your volunteers and your board members are checking their work emails all day long for their professional responsibilities. So if that's the only way that you're attracting and communicating, that might not meet them where they're at. So,
Yeah.
but then also with everything competing for our attention right now, our attention span is only 3 seconds or less.
Hmm.
And so that is also impact. We are working on the go. We are on the go. We're working from home. So those are all competing priorities as far as a
Hmm.
lot of volunteers and board members are in the sandwich generation. They're
Hmm.
caring for their younger ones, but they're also caring for their aging parents. So there's a lot of personal commitments
Hmm.
where the average time that a volunteer and a board member spends with a nonprofit is 1 hour a week. Pre-COVID, that was actually 3 hours a week.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's because we're getting busier and busier. And also, there are so many wonderful nonprofits in Missouri alone,
Hmm.
um, all with a mission, all serving the community. So it goes back to, is your nonprofit clear on your mission, and do you help them understand their why of how they might be connected to that mission? That's
Hmm.
the biggest thing. There's over 40,000 nonprofits in Missouri with the last
Hmm.
research that I did. Now, those include the universities and the hospitals and the
Sure.
churches, but still, there's amazing things happening in the communities. So, how are you clarifying your mission so that your mission resonates with that volunteer and that board member of why they're going to be engaged with your nonprofit?
Hmm. That sounds like not surprising, but kind of a daunting reality for those of us that need to get volunteers. And I certainly see some organizations that are extremely volunteer driven. I'm thinking of CASA organizations or food banks and
Mm-hmm.
pantries and other organizations like they truly could not operate without a bunch of volunteers. So do you have any creative strategies up your sleeve, or have you seen some cool trends on how to get the attention of potential volunteers? Like, what are some of the really cool organizations or approaches that they're doing to, hey, look at us, this is what we're doing, or engaging, or advertising, or I don't know. How do you compete? What are you seeing in this world?
A lot of it goes back to the clarity of your mission and how, like, where your dollars go. How are you
Mm,
impacting the community? And what does that look like for your organization? And
hmm.
then having that across all communication channels, all the
Mm,
social media, because depending on the type of volunteer and board member that you're looking for, are you present in their space that they look at digitally?
mm,
It could be LinkedIn, it could be Instagram, it could be Facebook, but if you're putting all your big eggs in one basket, you might not be attracting. And then
mm,
also the organic approach. If you already have star teams that support or star donors or already have volunteers, that's your core
right.
sphere circle of influence from an organic perspective is talking with them to say, who do you know in your influence that is, would be able to understand and support your mission.
Yeah,
But if your mission's not clear and then also consistent,
right.
with what you're doing on social media, does that also translate into your website? Does that also translate into your team members who are your
Hmm.
ambassadors as they walk around and represent your organization in the community? Is it their community presence? So those are all things. And then there are great organizations that uh, support the need for service hours. Alpha Phi
Hmm.
Omega is a service fraternity for men and women. I was in
Hmm.
it in college. That really helped, give me awareness of how to support the community. Where as students, you need X amount of service hours a
Right.
semester, and that's where I got to get involved with different
Mm,
organizations where I went to school.
yeah.
And so there are certain chapters. There's one here in St. Louis where we have, organizations that partner with to say, hey, we've got this event coming up, or we need some marketing materials. Would anyone within your organization who is studying to get a marketing degree, would they be able to help you with a
Hmm.
particular need or role that you have within your
Hmm.
nonprofit?
Yeah.
So it's just all, we all have that ripple effect of where our circles of influence are, and being able to really hone in on those in addition to the electronic and the digital presence that we have.
hmm Yeah, that's that's interesting that what you're talking about. Are you putting out there that you could benefit from volunteers, that there are spaces for volunteers in the places where these volunteers are hanging out? And it's interesting. I work with, hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits over my career, and it's amazing to me the vast difference of organizations that do a really, really great job with volunteer management and recruitment, right? And some of them have to. Like I said, we have some CASA organizations and some United Ways that we work with that use a lot of community partners and then food pantries and things like that, right? So I see where it's done really, really well, but some organizations could still benefit from volunteers, but it's very much kind of an afterthought. And they
Mm-hmm.
don't get a lot of volunteers that reach out because it's not front and forward of their website. It's not really identified a need. There's maybe
Mm-hmm.
nobody um, in-house that's specifically, designated to deal with volunteer management or recruitment of volunteers. It's interesting to me, Ron, have you seen a point? It's almost like I would imagine most organizations have to make the intentional effort to be volunteer driven to some
Mm-hmm.
degree, right? It has to be, I would imagine it almost has to be intentional. Where I think, and oftentimes in practice, it seems that maybe people are reaching out enough to volunteer and then the director of development or somebody's like, oh my God, I'm just like too busy to be able to do this. We need to finally hire somebody. That's more of a reactive approach. But do you ever see organizations that like, we don't really have a robust recruiting program for volunteers right now, but we're going to proactively create that role because we know this could be much bigger and we can have a bigger impact. Have you ever seen it work the other way? Because I feel like it's probably more reactive in real life.
Right. No, but I have seen organizations that have a role or have someone in a role that volunteer management is part of that role. But I've
Yeah,
also seen organizations where that's their only role,
right.
is to manage volunteers.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is, like you said, it's more organic. You're growing as an organization, a nonprofit. And so things are more reactive. I call it, you're flying the plane and
hmm
building it at the same time. And so you're
hmm
just putting band-aids and holes on things. I see that with
hmm
businesses and nonprofits with their people processes,
Sure.
is that they're just doing things as they come along and not necessarily taking a step back and doing, do we have a strategy around this? Do we have a
Mm-hmm.
framework
Right.
around this?
Yeah. I want to talk about boards a little bit because asking for a friend. No, I'm kidding. I sit on boards. I do some volunteerism, but I mostly in my volunteer capacity serve on boards now. And I'm especially interested in this because in my work, I work in collaboration with a lot of boards, right? As a fractional CFO firm, we often get hired by boards. Sometimes the finance committee is kind of championing the idea of outsourcing their accounting. And certainly we present to the board. So I have a lot of face time with boards and I have a lot of face time with organizational leaders that are frustrated with their boards. And quite frankly, the reverse is true too, right? Board members that are frustrated with their role or maybe the leadership or how they're engaged or not engaged within that organization. Let's talk a little bit about that. Um, how can how can leaders better engage their board members? What are some of the things that we're missing with board engagement? Because then I want to talk, I have a very specific question I want to get to with boards, but let's just start with there for continuity of the conversation. How could we specifically target or engage board members in a better, more meaningful way?
I think that also goes back to, how are you informing them and
Mm,
keeping them informed, and then how are you staying connected with them? So I
okay.
call it just the information and communication piece.
Okay.
Um, a lot of organizations I have seen don't have clearly defined board roles,
hmm
and you know, and it's twofold. Having general board expectations as a member, and
hmm
terms and
hmm
succession planning and whatnot, but then also if there's specific roles within the board, what does that entail? What does
hmm
that encounter? What's the organizational structure? If I have an issue as a board member, who am I supposed to go to for
Sure.
that?
Sure.
So a lot of that is that upfront communication and those expectations, but
hmm
then staying connected. Are you only talking to your board members at board meetings when you need updates from them? Or
Hmm.
is there ongoing, is there a connection to the mission? And once
Hmm.
again, is there an alignment with your board members to the mission? Do
Hmm.
they understand the impact? Do they understand their role in supporting your mission, supporting your fundraising efforts,
Hmm.
supporting ideas around how to find donors and how to interact and engage?
Hmm.
So, are you including them, or are your meetings just around updates?
Right.
That's what I hear a lot, from boards. I've been on several boards
Hmm.
over the years, and I also help support board development and leadership development, and creating connection with board members as well. And that's why it goes back to, if all I'm doing is hearing and giving updates in my board meetings, and that's it,
Hmm.
there's no connection to how am I making a difference? And it
Hmm.
goes back to, people want to be empowered. They want to know that
Hmm.
they are making a difference.
Yeah.
And if they're not seeing that, um, that really impacts the level of engagement with your board.
Agreed. Agreed. I wanted to come back to this one earlier. You were talking about onboarding and your onboarding experience. And we were kind of comparing this with employees, right? We're talking about, how do we recruit for employees? And what does that onboarding look like? What does their first day look like? What are the roles, responsibilities, expectations? Are those clear? And I was kind of thinking about volunteers, but specifically board members. What does the offboarding look like? You had hinted that at the very beginning of this conversation. And I think that I personally have participated in boards. Um, and when I was a staff person that worked for a nonprofit organization, and even in my role now, quite frankly, that you can just kind of tell when board members are disengaged or disgruntled or worse, right? Um, I don't know. Do you see organizations develop what offboarding processes look like? I know we have term limits, but sometimes it's normalizing and being comfortable maybe with hey, you really haven't had any attendance lately, or is this still a good fit for you? Because we've all participated in those boards, I think, where it's clear some people are just past the point in which they want to be there. And so is it better for the organization to just honor that for that person and let them roll off? Do you see organizations do this? And can you give some advice on this? Because I think everybody listening is like, oh yeah, maybe not now, but maybe that they have situations like this. And what should they be doing about that?
Yes, and I see both. I see a lot where it's reactive,
Mm,
or the frustration just continues to build, and on either side,
yeah.
without any action. And
Mm,
so the best way is to understand, how do you part ways where everyone is still an alumni that loves you,
right.
that there's still a good bridge, and that bridge hasn't been burnt, for
Right.
lack of a better word.
Right.
And it goes back to communication. So if
Mm,
you have a governance plan, if you have governance around what those board expectations are, so not only your term limits, but attendance. Many
mhm,
boards that I've been on, as well as that I've worked with, you have where you have a specific minimum attendance requirement. That if
mhm,
you're meeting quarterly, then it's expected for you as a board member to attend at least 3 of the 4 board meetings in some.
mhm,
So
mhm,
do you have someone in your organization to have a dashboard or track those governance components?
mhm,
Like with a board that meets monthly, being able to attend at least 10 of 12 of your monthly board meetings. So do
mhm,
we have someone to track that? And when we start noticing that a board member is not maybe fulfilling some of the tasks that are happening between the meetings, or they're
mhm,
not fully engaged, they're not attending, someone in leadership reaching out and asking the very question that you just brought up would
mhm,
be, you know, hey, does this still work with, where you're at in life? Basically,
mhm,
is it still
mhm,
aligned with where you're at and where you're wanting to go professionally and personally? How can we help? And coming from a place of just common ground, what,
mhm,
just listening to that other person and say, hey, is there anything we can do to help you be successful in this role? Is there
Hmm.
something that has shifted that maybe we need to talk about? And
Right.
if they are not able to fulfill the expectations that you've defined from a governance perspective, then, possibly parting ways to say,
Right.
is there a different capacity that you can help us with the organization that's not necessarily a board role? Maybe they just need
Mm.
to take a step back for other things. They don't want to say anything. They don't,
Right.
it's, there could be so many different reasons. So just opening up that conversation, and the more you have identified what those expectations are,
Right.
the more you can talk about it and just open lines of communication with that board member. And I've been in organizations where both with both volunteers and with board members, we've had to have that tough conversation around, I don't think it no longer aligns with either party.
Right.
And
Right.
nothing against the person. It's
Right.
just there's no longer alignment. I've had to have those conversations with
Yeah.
volunteers, because especially like in an accounting role, if you take on an accounting role as a volunteer, that's a very, powerful and important and critical piece if you are handling donor money and things like that. I'm
Hmm.
going back
Hmm.
many years now. Um,
Hmm.
and for various reasons, it's just that was not their strength. That was not
Hmm.
their priority at the time. And we needed to find someone who that would be a priority. So just explaining what the impact is or the need for that role, and is there still going to be an alignment with what they're looking for?
Yeah.
Because if not, then it's just the best way is just to say, how can we work together in a different capacity?
Yeah. I think my biggest takeaway too, I mean, it goes back to kind of comparing with employees, right? And if you don't have clear expectations defined and you don't have a way to track whether people are meeting those expectations or not, then I think over time you can continue to see more and more and more drift. And I've definitely served on boards long enough to see where some people are really engaged at points, and then over time it's like drift, drift, drift. But if you have situations where they're many year commitments, people want to honor you know, um, their commitments in that capacity. But the reality is, many other people in the room see the level of disengagement, and I would say the same is true for employees,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure for volunteers. If you have disengaged individuals in that space, or worse, when I say disgruntled, just bitter about being there, whatever it might be, there's tension there, whatever is happening. I've seen it all. That energy spreads, right? And is that a risk to the new incoming board members, for example? So I like the idea of, you had mentioned like the dashboard, tracking attendance, like not even just logging it in the board minutes, but is there a tracking somewhere where we can keep tabs on the actual basic requirements of all board members? And then even like you said at the committee level, are we making good on the individual responsibilities that we have? So I really like that. And I think, being okay with having that conversation about whether it makes sense still, because I fully support your concept of how do we all continue to support each other and
Mm-hmm.
you continue to have a lot more allies, for your cause before things get to a point where they're no longer a supporter, because they could come back in the future and maybe serve on a committee or maybe be a donor or just, a public advocate for the work that you're doing. So I think that's really important. And I wanted to call attention to that. So thanks for entertaining me there, Rhonda. Because I see that a lot in the nonprofit space. And I think it's important for people to kind of normalize having those types of conversations, because I think at the end of the day, sometimes people are relieved. And I've learned this in my role, as a service provider, that sometimes the relationship might have maybe run its course with a client, for example. And I tell my team, I want to have the conversation before we get to a point where the relationship is frayed in that way. Like, I would rather lift this conversation up. It's uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
but I think sometimes at the end of the day, people are grateful for it because nobody wanted to have that tough conversation. But people all know that something needs to shift. So
Right.
that's
And
super,
it's
super
coming
helpful.
from a place of finding common ground. It's coming
Yeah.
from a place of learning. I call it listening to learn,
Hmm.
and understanding, because we don't know what's happening with our people, with
Hmm.
our talent, with our
Right.
employees, our volunteers, our board members. And there's a lot shifting in our environment, and there's a lot of pressures. And so, like you said, it could be a relief to that other person. They're trying to fulfill their term, but
Hmm.
because of life happening to them, and they're not saying anything. So just opening up just a conversation, just to talk about things,
Hmm.
even though it might be uncomfortable at first, but if you're coming from a place of learning and
Yeah,
understanding and collaboration, that's going to go the longest way.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Well, Rhonda, I could talk about this all day. It's something I'm super passionate about. Like I said, working with so many nonprofits, being a volunteer and board member of a nonprofit, working so closely with the staff and also the board, I often find myself sometimes in the middle of things. So this conversation's been really helpful. I know that you do a lot of work in this space. If people want to learn more about your work, or connect with you about support that you can offer to their organization, where's the best place to find you?
Um,
Connect.
the best place is my website,
Okay.
because on my website, we talked a lot today about engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a free resource on my website for your
Oh,
employees, and it's an engagement quiz. So it's
okay.
really
Hmm.
easy to learn more about that and then look at my website. And then if you want more about volunteers and what we talked about today with volunteer engagement, um, I have a contact us form. Just type in your name, your email, and then type in the word volunteer, and I will email you the volunteer engagement assessment.
Okay. Thank
And with
you.
that, it just starts with a strategy session. I, have a 30-minute virtual strategy session just to talk more about, once you take the assessment, let's talk about a low
Mm-hmm.
score on there. And let's really
Mm-hmm.
brainstorm ways like we just did today, and strategies around how do you increase that score in one of those 14
Mm-hmm.
areas on the assessment. And we'll talk about that. And then
Yeah.
we could talk more about, if there's an opportunity to take a next step based
Mm-hmm.
on where you're at and what you need. We can explore that during the strategy session as well.
Mm-hmm. I
And I'm
love
also
that.
on LinkedIn. So I would love to connect on LinkedIn, and I share resources there too.
Okay, Rhonda. I'll make sure to put that in my show notes and everybody can connect with you and at least, like you said, go check out the free quiz and get some insights on your organization. I would imagine every organization comes, they're in a different place with engagement. And like you said, sometimes could be high on employee, but low on board and vice versa.
And it's constantly shifting. And, as
Yeah,
we continue to shift in today's world, we need to shift with our employees and our talent in general, our workforce in general, to figure out how do we meet them where they're at, and how
exactly.
do we create clarity and collaboration.
Thank you so much for that, Rhonda. Well, everybody, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for listening to a Modern Nonprofit podcast. If you found today's episode helpful or insightful, do me a favor, share it with someone else that you know can benefit from this conversation. I'm sure you know many leaders out there struggling with some sort of engagement, whether it's with employees or board members or volunteers. Hopefully, you found this information helpful. And if you did, also consider subscribing wherever you're listening, whether it's on YouTube or a streaming platform, engage with it in some way, because after all, that's how other nonprofit leaders like yourself can find content like this. Thank you all so much for joining us. See you next time. Bye.